Weirton, West Virginia, October 1949. The air thick with the metallic tang of the Weirton Steel Corporation carried the first premonition of winter. Along the terraced streets carved into the Ohio Valley hills, rows of identical arch-roofed military surplus shelters stood shoulder to shoulder. They were Quonset huts, the cheap, fast housing solution for the thousands of men who fed the mill's roaring furnaces. They were cold, ugly, and temporary, but they were home. On the edge of the third row, one man was doing something profoundly strange. Andrej Kováč was encasing his Quonset hut in a perfect, 9-inch thick shell of common red brick. Day after day, he worked with a quiet, unnerving precision. The scrape of his trowel, the soft thud of a buttered brick being set, the sharp tink as he tapped it level. These were the only sounds he made. His neighbors, mostly men who worked the blast furnaces and rolling mills, watched him from their identical iron homes. "What in God's name is the Slovak building?" muttered a roller named Bill Stipe to his neighbor. "A tomb for a tin can?" Merlin Paget, the housing agent from Weirton Steel, stood with his hands on his hips, a clipboard under his arm. Paget was a man who understood regulations, material allowances, and depreciation schedules. He did not understand this. "It's a waste of good brick is what it is," he declared, his voice carrying down the row. "He's putting a coat and tie on a pig. Come April, that structure's getting reassessed. He's turning a shanty into a taxable asset. Foolish." The word spread through the steel patch. Andrej Kováč, the quiet combat engineer, had gone mad. He was building a brick oven around his family, and everyone knew what happened when you put metal in an oven. It cooked. By the time the first frost silvered the corrugated iron roofs of every other Quonset, Andrej's was a strange, beautiful, and universally mocked brick arch standing alone in a sea of tin. What did this Slovak-American combat engineer, a man raised in the shadow of Bratislava's brickyards, understand about thermal capacitance and dead air insulation that a whole valley of practical, experienced steelmen had missed? The answer would not be found in debate or argument. It would be written in coal smoke, measured in degrees Fahrenheit, and proven by the simple, miraculous act of rising dough in the dead of winter. It's a story of quiet knowledge against loud opinion, and if you stick around, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermal physics that could change how you think about staying warm. Before we lay the next course of brick, please take a moment to subscribe and click the like button. Let us know in the comments. What's the strangest, most effective homemade solution you've ever seen for beating the cold? Andrej Kováč was not a carpenter. He was not a steel worker. He was a man of fired earth. His memory was not of lumber mills or blast furnaces, but of the deep, pervasive warmth of the brick kilns outside Bratislava. He remembered his father, a master mason, holding a freshly fired brick, its heat radiating into the cool Slovak evening. "This is a battery, Andrejko," his father would say, his voice a low rumble. "It holds the sun. It holds the fire. It breathes it out slowly when the world is cold." He learned the language of mortar and the geometry of bonds, Flemish, English, monk, before he learned to properly conjugate English verbs. The American Army took that innate knowledge and sharpened it on the whetstone of war. As a combat engineer in the Pacific, Andrej didn't build with wood. He built bunkers. His job was to line steel and concrete shells with internal layers, creating structures that could withstand both ordnance and the suffocating tropical heat. He learned about thermal breaks and the insulating power of an air gap. He saw firsthand how a layer of masonry, separated from a metal skin, could keep an ammunition store cool and dry in the sweltering jungle humidity. He was lining a bunker in the Philippines when he had the thought, if this works to keep heat out, it must also work to keep heat in. When the war ended, he brought his wife, Elena, and their two small children, Jan and Zuzana, to Weirton. The promise of steady work at the mill was a powerful lure. The housing provided was a Quonset hut, number 317. Andrej knew its weaknesses the moment he stepped inside. It was a single-skinned metal tube, a perfect conductor, designed to shed heat as efficiently as possible. It was a structure built for the tropical heat of the Pacific, not the brutal, damp cold of an Ohio Valley winter. Their first winter, in 1948, was a lesson in misery. The cold didn't just seep in, it flooded the space. The thin iron walls were coated in a permanent layer of interior frost that glittered in the weak morning light. The family lived in a small huddle around the coal stove, which devoured their fuel allowance at an astonishing rate, yet failed to warm anything more than 5 feet away. One frigid January morning, Elena was using their wringer washer when the metal roller shaft, contracted by the intense cold, snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, spraying icy water across the floor. A week later, their small hot water tank, its iron stressed beyond its limits by the constant freezing and heating cycle, split its main seam in a jagged lightning bolt crack. By the feast of the Epiphany, the small plaster nativity scene Elena had carefully placed in the parlor was frozen fast to its wooden base. They slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air. Andrej watched his children's constant coughing and his wife's chapped, weary hands, and the memory of his father's words returned. "This holds the fire. It breathes it out slowly." He would not let his family suffer through another winter like that. He would build them a kiln. The failure of the standard Quonset hut was a simple, brutal matter of physics. Corrugated iron has a thermal resistance, or R value, of virtually 0. For every degree of difference between inside and outside temperature, heat energy raced through the metal skin, desperate to achieve equilibrium. The only thing standing between a family and the West Virginia winter was a thin layer of paint and a sheet of steel less than a 1/16 of an inch thick. In technical terms, the structure was a catastrophic thermal bridge. The result was a constant losing battle. The coal stove in the center of the hut pumped out thousands of British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat. But the conductive nature of the walls pulled that heat away faster than the stove could produce it. The hot air would rise, hit the freezing metal ceiling, cool instantly, and sink back down, creating a relentless cycle of drafts. To feel any warmth, a family had to be practically sitting on top of the stove. The floors were always icy, the bedding always damp. Men would come home from a 12-hour shift in the searing heat of the mill, only to find their homes as cold as a walk-in freezer. The O'Malley family in Hut 315 burned through their winter coal allotment by mid-January and had to buy more on credit from the company store, starting a cycle of debt. The Polanskis in 319 tried to insulate by stuffing old newspapers between the walls and the interior framing. But the moisture condensing on the cold iron turned the paper into a sodden, moldy pulp that did more harm than good. Every morning, the row of Quonsets puffed out desperate columns of thick, black smoke, a visible measure of the energy being wasted in the fight against the cold. The problem wasn't the stoves. The problem wasn't the coal. The problem was the house itself. It was a sieve designed to leak heat. Andrej Kováč understood this. He knew you couldn't solve the problem by making a bigger fire. You had to change the very nature of the wall. In the late summer of 1949, Andrej began his work. He first laid a shallow concrete footing around the entire perimeter of the Quonset, extending about a foot out. He bartered for used, but solid, common brick from a demolition site in Steubenville, trading 2 weeks of his off-shift time to help salvage them. He stacked them neatly, thousands of them, a mountain of fired red clay beside his tin home. Then, the slow, methodical construction began. He didn't simply slap a layer of brick against the metal. That would have been useless, merely creating a better thermal bridge. The secret, the lesson from the bunkers and the kilns, was in the gap. He meticulously built the brick wall with a constant 3-inch air space between the back of the brick and the corrugated face of the Quonset. To the casual observer, it looked like shoddy work, a wall not even touching the building it was meant to protect. To Andrej, that gap was everything. It was a space of thermal decoupling. It was a wall of still air. He laid the bricks in a Flemish bond, a pattern of alternating headers and stretchers that was not only strong but beautiful, a small piece of old-world craftsmanship in this valley of industrial expediency. He left small weep holes in the very bottom course of bricks, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, to allow any moisture that might condense in the gap to escape. As the brick shell rose, so did the commentary. Merlin Paget made his official visit in early November, when the wall was halfway up the arch. He tapped the brickwork with his pen. "Mr. Kováč," he began, his tone dripping with bureaucratic authority. "This is an unauthorized structural modification. The Weirton Steel Housing Agreement specifies a Grade D shelter. What you're building here, this approaches Grade C. It's an improvement." Andrej straightened up from his work, wiping mortar from his hands onto his trousers. He simply nodded. Paget sighed, frustrated by the man's silence. "You understand what that means, don't you? When this is finished, I have to reclassify the lot. Your assessment will go up. Your rent. You're costing yourself money, man." "For what? A brick decoration?" "It will be warm," Andrej said, his voice quiet. It was the only explanation he ever offered. Paget shook his head and made a note on his clipboard. "Suit yourself, but the company will get its share of your foolishness." He walked away, leaving Andrej to his work. The mockery lasted for the rest of the autumn. The validation would last for the rest of their lives. Andrej's neighbors saw a man building a brick wall. What they didn't see was the physics engine he was assembling. The system had 2 core components, each working in concert: the dead air gap and the thermal mass of the brick. First, the gap. The 3 inches of still air Andrej so carefully maintained between the brick and the iron was the primary insulator. Air itself is a poor conductor of heat, but only if it's kept still. Trapped in that 3-inch cavity, it couldn't circulate and create the convection currents that would carry heat away. This single feature transformed the thermal performance of the wall. The original Quonset's metal skin had an R value of perhaps R2, counting the interior air film. By adding the 3-inch dead air space and the 9-inch brick veneer, Andrej increased the wall's total R value to over R11. He had effectively wrapped his home in a thick, invisible blanket of air. This decoupling meant the frigid temperature of the outer metal shell was no longer directly conducted to the interior living space. But insulation was only half the equation. The true genius was the second component, the 9-inch brick shell. This was not insulation. This was thermal capacitance. It was the battery his father had spoken of. A standard 9-inch thick wall of common brick weighing about 120 pounds per cubic foot has the capacity to store an enormous amount of heat energy. For every linear foot of his 20-foot wide Quonset, Andrej's brick shell could absorb and hold approximately 14,400 BTUs of heat. Here's how it worked. During the day, the coal stove ran, heating the air inside the Quonset. That heat would slowly transfer through the thin metal skin and into the dead air gap. From there, it would be absorbed by the immense thermal mass of the inner face of the brick wall. The brick soaked up the heat like a sponge, slowly, steadily, all day long. The process was incredibly efficient. Very little heat ever made it to the outside world. Then, at night, when the fire in the stove was banked low to conserve coal, The physics reversed. As the temperature inside the Quonset began to drop, the thousands of pounds of warm brick began to release their stored energy. The bricks began to radiate their heat, not outwards into the cold night, but inwards, back across the air gap, through the metal shell, and into the living space. The house had become its own furnace. The brick wall was designed to have a thermal lag of over 34 hours. It was a slow, steady, radiant heat that kept the interior temperature remarkably stable, without the wild swings of a conventional cabin. Andrej had built a system that didn't just fight the cold, it managed heat, storing it when it was plentiful, and releasing it when it was needed most. That winter, the Ohio Valley descended into a state of siege. A polar vortex, a term they wouldn't have known, locked itself over the region, plunging temperatures into a sustained, brutal cold snap. For 12 consecutive days, the thermometer in Weirton never rose above -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The crisis was compounded by a temperature inversion. The heavy, cold air acted like a lid, trapping the thick, sulfurous coal smoke from the steel mill at the bottom of the valley. A 60-foot-deep layer of acrid gray smog pooled around the houses, so thick and persistent that the sun never once managed to touch the south-facing walls of the Quonsets. It was a sunless, suffocating, and profoundly dangerous cold. For the residents of the housing row, it was a nightmare. The flimsy Quonsets were no match for the assault. Men burned through a month's worth of coal in a week. The constant smoke from their own overworked stoves only added to the smog choking the air outside. Inside, life ground to a halt. Water pipes froze solid. Food left on a kitchen counter would be frozen by morning. Families abandoned all pretense of using the whole house, sealing off bedrooms and living in a miserable cluster around their stoves, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The sound of hacking coughs became the valley's winter soundtrack. But in Hut 317, something was different. From the outside, the only sign of life was the thin, almost lazy curl of smoke from its chimney pipe. Inside, an impossible normalcy prevailed. The air was still and quiet. There were no drafts. Young Jan and Zuzana could play on the floor in their stocking feet without their toes going numb. The interior walls were cool to the touch but not cold, and certainly not coated in the shimmering frost that plagued their neighbors. The coal stove consumed fuel at a slow, steady, miserly rate. The ultimate proof of Andrej's success sat on a small wooden shelf on the interior wall of the kitchen. It was a simple glass jar, covered with a cloth. Elena's starter dough for halushki, the Slovak potato dumplings that were a staple of their diet. In every other kitchen in the valley, any dough left out was a cold, gray, lifeless ball until the first thaw of spring. Yeast needed warmth to live, to breathe, to work its magic. In the Kováč household, the yeast was thriving. All through the 12 days of the great cold, Elena's dough continued to rise and roll, bubbling gently with life. It was a small, domestic miracle, a testament to the thousands of BTUs of stored heat breathing silently out of the brick walls, keeping the heart of their home alive. Merlin Paget was miserable. His job during the cold snap was to walk the housing rows at shift change, the coldest part of the evening, and log any furnace smoke violations. The company had strict rules about over-firing the stoves, intended to prevent chimney fires and conserve the company-supplied coal. It was a rule universally ignored during a freeze like this, but a rule he was nonetheless paid to enforce. His face was numb, his mustache stiff with frozen breath. The pencil in his gloved hand was clumsy, its graphite lead so cold it barely made a mark on the frozen paper of his clipboard. He walked down the third row, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and desperation. Every Quonset was belching a thick black plume of smoke, a sign of a stove being pushed to its absolute limit. He made his notes, his fingers aching. Then he reached Hut 317. He stopped confused. The chimney was barely breathing, a thin wisp of clean gray smoke lazily drifting upwards. It was the smoke of a well-banked, efficient fire, not one fighting for its life against -22 degrees. It was a violation of a different sort, a violation of expectation. He squinted at the brick arch, a dark, solid shape in the smoggy twilight. He needed to steady his clipboard to write. Without thinking, he leaned his shoulder and the side of his head against the south-facing brick wall. He expected the biting cold of masonry that had seen no sun for nearly 2 weeks. He expected the damp chill that would suck the warmth right out of his coat. What he felt was something else entirely. It was a deep, pervasive, and utterly impossible warmth. It wasn't hot, not like a stove. It was a gentle, radiant heat, a low hum of thermal energy pressing through his thick wool coat, into his shoulder, down his arm. He pressed the palm of his gloved hand flat against the brick. It felt like a sun-warmed stone on a summer afternoon. He pulled off his glove with his teeth, needing to feel it with his bare skin. The brick was smooth, dry, and radiating a steady, life-giving warmth. He leaned in closer, pressing his cheek against the wall. The cold ache in his jaw began to recede. He could feel the frozen hairs of his beard begin to soften and thaw against the impossible heat. He took out his pencil to make a note, resting the tip against the brick. The thin layer of frost that had accumulated on the metal ferrule vanished, turning into a tiny bead of water that ran down the yellow paint. Merlin Paget stood there for a full minute, his bare hand and cheek pressed against the wall of the house he had called foolish. He didn't knock. He didn't need to see inside. The proof was right here, radiating into the coldest night he had ever known. He understood. Andrej Kováč hadn't built a decoration. He hadn't built a simple wall. He had built a reservoir. You didn't build a better fire. You built a better battery. In that moment, all the regulations, the assessments, and the mockery turned to dust. All that was left was the undeniable, radiant truth. When the great cold finally broke and a weak spring sun returned to the Ohio Valley, Merlin Paget did not hand Andrej Kováč a notice of reassessment. Instead, he came to Hut 317 with a notepad and a pencil, and he said, "Mr. Kováč, my name is Merlin Paget. I would be grateful if you would teach me." Andrej, a man of few words, simply invited him inside. Over coffee and Elena's fresh halushki, he sketched the design on a piece of butcher paper. He explained the air gap, the weep holes, the thermal mass. Paget, a man of ledgers and rules, listened with the focus of a convert. He saw not just a clever design, but a solution. A way to save the company money on coal, to reduce housing maintenance, to make life for the workers bearable. He helped Andrej refine the drawing, adding measurements and labels in his neat, bureaucratic hand. The story of the warm Quonset spread, first by word of mouth, then through a more formal channel. Paget, using his connections, submitted the diagram and a short article to the Jednota Bulletin, the official publication of the First Catholic Slovak Union, headquartered in Cleveland. In the March 1950 issue, there it was. A Method for Winterproofing Standard Mill Housing by Andrej Kováč, as told to Ms. Paget. The idea found fertile ground among the Slovak-American communities scattered across the steel and coal patches of the Rust Belt. These were practical people who understood the value of a dollar and the brutal reality of a northern winter. They were immigrants and sons of immigrants who trusted the hard-won knowledge of their own people over the dictates of company engineers. By the autumn of 1950, 7 other veteran families, from Youngstown, Ohio, to the coal fields of southern West Virginia, had encased their own company houses in a shell of brick. The Kováč Kiln, as some began to call it, was spreading. It was a quiet revolution of fired earth and still air. The principles Andrej Kováč applied out of memory and necessity are now central tenets of modern building science. His 3-inch air gap is the direct ancestor of the ventilated rain screen systems used in high-performance construction today, creating a thermal break that dramatically improves a building's energy efficiency. His use of the heavy brick shell as a thermal battery is a perfect demonstration of passive solar design, where a building's own mass is used to absorb and regulate heat, reducing the load on mechanical systems. Engineers today talk about thermal capacitance, phase change materials, and dynamic insulation, using complex software to model heat flow. Andrej Kováč modeled it with his hands, using the lessons of a Bratislava brickyard and a Pacific bunker. He didn't have the vocabulary of modern science, but he had a deep, intuitive understanding of the physics. He proved that on the frontier of survival, the most effective solutions are often born not from new technology, but from the intelligent application of ancient wisdom. In the end, Andrej Kováč's project was a profound act of redefinition. The other residents of Weirton saw the cold as an enemy to be fought, an invading force to be repelled with bigger fires and thicker walls. They saw the house as a fortress. Andrej saw it differently. He understood that the bitter cold was a constant, and the precious heat from his stove was a finite resource. The challenge wasn't to fight the cold, but to tame the heat. He didn't clad the metal to protect it from the winter. He didn't build a shield. His neighbors were trying to build armor. Andrej Kováč built an organ. He gave the simple tin box a thick, warm-blooded skin that could manage its own temperature, inhaling heat when it was abundant and exhaling it when it was scarce. He taught the Quonset to become the wall of its own kiln. He taught it how to hold the fire. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and thermal physics valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light. Let us know in the comments, what other historical building techniques deserve a closer look? We read every one. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.